Not long ago, if police wanted to know where someone drove, they would have to follow that person for days, taking significant resources. But new technology allows the government to track everyone, nearly all the time, and to access that information without a warrant. As this technology spreads around the country, people are fighting back. I'm Kim Norberg of the nonprofit civil liberties law firm, the Institute for Justice, joined by co-host Keith Neely. Today we have with us IJ attorneys Robert Fromer and Michael Soyfer to discuss a new Fourth Amendment lawsuit in Norfolk, Virginia. This is Beyond the Brief. So Rob, can you explain what's going on in Norfolk?
The city has paired up with this company called Flock Cameras, and they've installed 172 cameras in the city that allows them to track the entire driving population. And this is part of the largest domestic surveillance program in the entire United States.
So when you talk about that, the largest domestic surveillance program, what does that mean?
So all of the city's cameras are feeding into an unprecedented nationwide database maintained by a tech company called Flock Safety. Flock Safety tracks people's movements in 5,000 communities across the country for 30 days at a time, and it boasts that it gets something like 1 billion plate reads per month.
So when you talk about camera tracking and it keeps track of people's movements for 30 days, I mean, are we talking about a database where you can see, Jane Smith went to the grocery store and then she went to Target and then she picked up her kid from school? Are we talking about that level of granularity?
They can potentially in places like Norfolk, where there are so many cameras that you can follow people from place to place, and you can make deductions like that by looking at what their routines are.
Yeah, our client Lee, for instance, one of his big problems with the cameras once he learned about them is he realized that when he got to the intersection, if he went left, they knew he was going to his daughter's school. If he went straight, he might be going to the gun range, or if he makes a right, he's going to church. And that's exactly what's so scary about these technologies, is that you can piece the individual portraits of people's lives together and get a really detailed map of what they're doing.
So these are tracking movements, right? And not things like traffic violations or something. How does that work?
Well, often, everybody knows about red light cameras, speed cameras, things like that. And the big difference is just what you pointed out, that the only time they ever fire, the only time they're ever taking a picture is when they sense a violation of law. But these flock cameras, they're completely different. They watch 24/7. They don't care if you did anything right or did anything wrong. Doesn't matter if they have any suspicion. They record everything, and it all gets fed up into their database where the AI creates this detailed vehicle fingerprint that lets them track you everywhere you go.
And so who has access to the raw data here? Is it police? Is it anyone in the municipal government? Does Flock have unfettered access to this?
It's whoever the Norfolk Police Department decides to give access. Each Flock customer gets to regulate who can see their data. We now understand that Norfolk has actually given every Flock user access to its data. And that's all dictated by every individual police department's policy about who has access and who doesn't. In Norfolk, for instance, every uniformed officer has access. They're required to log in and stay on for their entire shifts. They need a law enforcement purpose to search the database. But the policy that the Norfolk Police Department adopted doesn't say what a law enforcement purpose is. And in practice, all they have to do is say why they're enter a reason for a search and then go at it. But no one is proactively monitoring their access the way that, say, a magistrate judge would proactively monitor a search.
Right, because, there's no warrant requirement for any of this. And I know we're about to talk about that, but I was struck by something that you just mentioned. You said that every user in Norfolk can track not only their data, but is it also their neighbor's data? I wasn't sure what you meant by all of the data is publicly available.
No, it's not publicly available. It's available to every Flock user.
I see. So
generally law enforcement departments across the country.
Gotcha.
So a police officer in, I don't know what other cities Flock is in, but in Kansas or something, can check.
That's a notable
and
city,
see.
Kansas.
Yeah. Sure.
I often vacation in the beautiful city
Well,
of Kansas.
I love that you bring up Kansas, because Wichita, Kansas had some issues recently with 2 officers in departments just outside Wichita using Wichita's flock data to stalk their exes.
Oh, my goodness.
Wow. So if those exes went to Norfolk, they could track them all the way to Norfolk. I mean, setting aside, obviously, how entirely creepy it is to use it for something like this.
Right, because our understanding now is that Norfolk has given flock users across the country access to its data. So potentially, yes, they could follow them to Norfolk. They could potentially even follow them all the way to California.
Yeah. Imagine you get crosswise with an officer while you're on vacation in California. Next thing you know, he's like searching through the flock system to see what he can get you on.
So all of this is really creepy, but like, what's the constitutional problem here?
Well, the big problem here is that this is a massive invasion of people's security. The Fourth Amendment was designed out of concern for these things called general warrants, which gave officers in the field the unilateral power, the arbitrary power to invade people's houses, persons, property, searching for whatever they wanted. And that was a major cause of the revolution. And so when we enacted the Fourth Amendment, we said, no, we need to interpose a judge between the officer and individuals so they can be secure, so they don't have to be constantly looking over their shoulder. But with these flock cameras, this is just a digital reincarnation of the general warrants we fought a revolution to end.
There's sort of this like reasonable expectation of privacy kind of coloring to things involving the Fourth Amendment, right? And so somebody who is, driving through town and a police officer is standing on a street corner and takes a picture of their license plate or something, that you don't have necessarily a reasonable expectation of privacy from that kind of activity. So where does this system kind of cross that line?
Well, that's a good question. It's not really clear. And that's part of the problem with the reasonable expectation of privacy model is it says, oh, okay, you can take a picture. One picture is okay, but a bunch of pictures, maybe not okay. And where's that dividing line? We don't know. Because it's going on, really judges deciding for all of society what they themselves think is reasonable for society to expect. A much simpler way to go about this is just to say, are the police investigating your person and property? And if they are, then we can then we're at least in the Fourth Amendment box, and we can start asking, well, is this the kind of thing we need them to get a warrant before they do? Right now, the reasonable expectation of privacy model says either you have to absolutely get a warrant, or the police can do this to anybody, anytime, for whatever reason they want.
So would you need a warrant to access the data, to do kind of a search or, a surveillance of a specific person? Or do you need a warrant to sort of take the pictures and aggregate the data and apply this algorithm and things like that in the first place?
Well, I think this current system as designed is flatly unconstitutional because it's without a warrant, without any suspicion, collecting all the data of everyone who's driving by and creating these unique vehicle fingerprints. A system that, for instance, only takes a picture when it senses a violation of law, like the speed cameras or red light cameras, doesn't create that same problem. And in a situation like this, I think that these cameras as currently constructed just simply are not compatible with the Fourth Amendment. Our right to be secure means that we can't have these brooding cameras watching us 24/7, keeping tabs on everywhere we go.
Well, and one of the challenges with cats and the reasonable expectation of privacy is, this...
Really quick, what's cats? Because you don't mean like
right,
meow cats.
Right, you're right. So CATS, K-A-T-Z, is a Supreme Court case, I want to say from the 60s, 70s? Late 60s. It involved a wiretap that was placed in a public phone booth. And the question was, did that placement of the wiretap without a warrant violate that person's constitutional rights under the Fourth Amendment? And the court outlined this sort of reasonable expectation of privacy. Would you, standing in a public phone booth, have a reasonable expectation of privacy that you would not be overheard? And one of the challenges with cats in this reasonable expectation of privacy test as it's developed over time is that technology has rapidly changed in a way that what was private 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago is now a lot less private because you carry cell phones with you. Those can be tracked fairly easily. I remember a case from law school involving police that used thermal imaging to detect where a person was growing marijuana illicitly because those require heat lamps. And they could use the thermal imaging and tell, oh, that house is generating a lot more heat than it should. Therefore, I think there's drugs there. They did a bust, and there was. And so how does the growth of technology square with the Fourth Amendment, which was obviously designed without any foresight about these sorts of developments?
In recent cases involving technology and the Fourth Amendment, what the Supreme Court has tried to do is keep constant the level of privacy that existed at the founding. So not necessarily just embodying the specific rules or technologies that may have existed then, but just the baseline level of privacy that people had at the founding. At the founding, someone could have seen you in the public square on a public street. Someone, I guess, could have seen your wagon riding by. But the expectation then was that no one would follow you and catalog all of your public movements into a database to be consulted later. That just wasn't possible. What Norfolk is doing requires a really fanciful analogy to put it in, 1791 terms. It would have required posting officers in 172 places and having them, catalog the license plate number of everyone that went by to the extent that they could see it and remember it and write it down in time. And the fact that you have to make that sort of fanciful, basically impossible analogy means that this is upsetting long-settled expectations of privacy that have existed since the founding. And that's why under current doctrine, this runs afoul of the Fourth Amendment, even setting aside the problems with that.
Yeah. And I think more broadly, the case that we're dealing with in Norfolk and shows the problems with the reasonable expectation of privacy and really using privacy as the frame by which we judge our Fourth Amendment rights. Because the word privacy doesn't appear anywhere in the Fourth Amendment. It does use the word to be secure. And, you go back to dictionaries from the time, it meant the same thing it does now. To be secure means to be free of danger or free of fear. And the idea is that we're supposed to be able to live our lives and be secure in our persons and property without the kind of arbitrary tracking that systems like the Norfolk flock cameras allow. But because we've gone down this privacy road, it's really created this conundrum where, like, anything you expose to the public, they say, courts will say you have no Fourth Amendment protection in. And the cases that Michael was talking about, where in recent years they've sort of done, they said, oh no, this new technology, this is, despite what we've said in other cases, this does require a warrant to get, is really a bunch of one-off Band-Aids that they're putting on it, because the underlying model that they're using, this privacy model, isn't sufficiently protective of our rights, and it really needs a complete rehaul.
Well, and one of the other problems with this system, as I understand it, is that there are opportunities for police and Flock to use, artificial intelligence advances on the back end to take that raw data and then develop and detect the pattern so you can more easily track movements. I mean, you can imagine just raw, license plate numbers from 172 cameras, probably not all that useful, but when you can analyze them and aggregate them and figure out who's going where and when, and perhaps even why, that's when things start to get a lot creepier.
Yeah, I mean, Michael's analogy earlier about, what would this have looked like in 1791, it's
right.
Many levels more impossible, because this idea of imposing an algorithm onto that data is just so alien to that time.
And of course, the Fourth Amendment has just as much to say about this. Nobody says about the First Amendment, for instance, it says speech and press. So if you want to make music or do art, no, those aren't covered by that. We look at that broadly. We understand, expressive things, you get protection when you want to express yourself. Similarly, the Fourth Amendment should have that same reading. Instead of narrowly focusing on, well, this isn't a person, house, paper, or effect, we should be looking at people need to be secure while they're living their lives. And that means being free from the risk of arbitrary government surveillance, invasions to their persons and property. And that is a much better much more protective of our rights than what we currently have.
A lot of the cases that inspired the Fourth Amendment were searches for papers. And the framers were really, really hostile to searches of and for people's papers because papers in 1791 were where you recorded all of your secrets. And that's what horrified them so much, that someone could discover your secrets by rifling through your papers.
Did you know IJ represents ordinary people, free of charge, as they fight back against government abuse? If you're looking for a rewarding way to support our work, consider becoming a member of our merry band of monthly donors and stand shoulder to shoulder with IJ's clients every month of the year. Monthly donations are convenient and cost efficient, meaning more of your money goes directly to our fight for freedom and justice. Sign up to donate today at ij.org/monthly.
I'm going to take off my lawyer hat for a second and put on my tech enthusiast cap, because I have a Flock-related question that maybe you guys have the answer to, maybe not, depending on where you guys are in the case. But are there any requirements for Flock to maintain this data securely? I mean, is this data subject perhaps to a hacker attack, or worse, could Flock legally take that data and sell it to private advertisers? You know, you might imagine that information could be really valuable, knowing where you go and where you shop. I mean, that's when things really start getting a little bit creepy, if they weren't creepy enough already.
Yeah, there are definitely state law limitations on what Flock can do with the data, and potentially contractual limitations. I can't speak to all of those. I wish I were a data privacy lawyer. But I'm sure Flock is subject to extensive regulation. You do bring up a valid concern, though, which is that Flock could get hacked. We saw that Customs and Border Patrol's license plate reader vendor was hacked, and a bunch of pictures of people's cars and license plates at the border were made available for sale on the dark web. There's no reason to believe that the same thing couldn't happen to Flock, though as far as we're aware, it hasn't yet.
Well, and we have all these, IJ has all these cases about government retaliation and this sort of idea that, someone does something that the government doesn't like, and then they kind of, go back and dig up whatever they can to charge that person with kind of after the fact. And to me, the idea of this kind of being an ample resource for that of, throwing me in jail because the government doesn't like me or something is way scarier than, someone might advertise to me, right? Like the government use of this still seems more horrifying.
Well, and that's, again, that goes back to the whole point of the Fourth Amendment and why privacy is the wrong thing. I'm not worried about privacy against like some marketer. What I'm worried about is people with guns who can put me in jail showing up and trying to do just that based on that. And we have a unique concern about government agents because they're the ones who can put us in jail. They're the ones who can, kill us in certain situations. And so by focusing on security, let's push all that stuff about marketers to the side. Let's focus on what really matters here, which is protecting us against an overbearing government.
So you guys have been talking about cats and sort of this reasonable expectation of privacy, and maybe that's not the right test to be looking at Fourth Amendment violations through. And so is the goal here to sort of overturn that precedent and replace it with something else? Or are we trying to say that, this fails even the cat standard, or kind of maybe both? Like, what's the big picture goal here?
I'd say for this case is to end Norfolk's persistent surveillance of the population, get courts across the country to recognize the threat of these arbitrary surveillance systems, and also to start demonstrating to courts why that cat's reasonable expectation of privacy model is flawed and should be replaced. After all, it suggests that anything you do in public, you get no Fourth Amendment protection on, which creates these bizarre line drawing exercises where we have to decide, well, how much surveillance is enough before it turns into a search. By contrast, I think long-term what we're trying to do is replace that test with our own theory of the Fourth Amendment, which is really just based in sort of the ordinary meaning of words and understood basic principles of property and contract law, to say, like, when the government takes a purposeful investigative act towards you or your property, that's a search. And if it's invasive, beyond like the red light camera or stop camera, we need to put a judge in there. That's much more secure provides us more security, no pun intended, than the privacy model. And most importantly, we were talking about this earlier, it's technologically neutral. What we've seen with the privacy model is as technology has advanced, our Fourth Amendment rights have necessarily decreased. And that's because we use that privacy model, that privacy frame, which says, again, anything you put out in the public, you get no protection on. By replacing it with saying we have a right to be secure against arbitrary government invasion, that protects us regardless of what manner that invasion might happen to take.
Now, I'm assuming that proponents of this sort of a program would argue, well, this helps us protect against crime. It helps keeps our community safer. What's the response to that? I mean, first, is there anything that you guys have seen so far to suggest that this system has actually helped prevent or catch crime after it's occurred? And then I guess the follow-up question is, if it is helpful in protecting crime, does that matter for the Fourth Amendment? Because in a certain sense, every Fourth Amendment right makes it harder for police to catch criminals. You have to get a warrant before you can search someone's home. Should that matter in figuring out whether, a program like this violates the Fourth Amendment?
Absolutely. So it's really debatable whether it's decreased crime. Flock has put forward some studies that say it decreases crime. They like to tout every time flock data are used to solve a crime or prevent a crime or catch someone, get a lead, things like that. Others have really questioned whether, on the whole, this actually decreases crime. And there's really no need to catalog everyone's movements everywhere to decrease crime, right? We would have very little crime probably if we made everyone put on a body camera and walk around all
Right.
day with it. But we don't do that. And why? Because we think the trade-off of living in a society where our daily lives are kind of spoon-fed to the government for storage in a huge database is worse than putting up with a little bit of crime. And the Fourth Amendment doesn't embody that sort of trade-off, well, if this fights crime, then we'll give up our rights to accommodate that. The framers made a choice, and that choice sometimes means that, criminals get away with it. But we all live in a better society. We don't live under the eye of government surveillance 24/7 because of it.
This idea of surveillance as a deterrent that could be persuasive kind of at first blush, right? Like it seems like, oh, okay, we want to have a safe community, and if people are being watched, they're be on better behavior or something like that. Like that, there's a world where that's kind of a reasonable thing to want, but then you end up in this strange like pre-crime Minority Report sort of universe where you're treating, presumably innocent people kind of worse than criminals a little bit. Because Keith was talking about, you need to have a warrant to search a person who you actually suspect of a crime's home. And so how do you is there any sort of balancing needed here, or how do you think about that?
Well, I'd say, put simply, the Fourth Amendment is the balance. I mean, the framers fought a revolution in large part because they didn't like the arbitrary power of officials to invade their persons and property without getting pre-clearance from a judge. That is the embodiment of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment promises us security, not surveillance. And so we have to maintain that line, or else you're right. To be honest, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And you keep going down that primrose path, and it's not going to look so much like the United States. It's going to look like communist China.
So what would make flock cameras constitutional?
I was just about to ask that. Yeah. Is there a system in which this could be constitutional?
As currently constructed, no.
If they had, 172 cameras, but they didn't have the algorithm, or, if they weren't sharing the data with other cities, or, if they didn't have access to it, like what element of it, I know that you kind of probably don't want to answer this question, but like what element of it kind of tips the scale?
I mean, that's a great question. And it should have been one that Flock or any of these governments ever asked themselves. Instead, they just decided, because we can build this thing, we will build this thing and we'll deploy it. The system is currently constructed as unconstitutional. It pervasively tracks every vehicle in 5,000 communities across the nation. That's insane. Could this system be constitutional? Not as it's currently constructed, but possibly. Maybe it's a system where the cameras are told to only send images of cars that have been named in a warrant, for instance, a search warrant. And so otherwise, the cameras just leave everybody alone. That could potentially be constitutional. But that requires courts to actually get into the weeds of the Fourth Amendment. And the problem with our current reasonable expectation of privacy formulation is that either something is a search and it can't happen at all without a warrant, or it's completely unregulated whatsoever, meaning that really officers are the ones to decide for themselves what to do.
I just want to add to Rob's point, Norfolk is paying millions of dollars to Flock to maintain these 172 cameras. And I question whether that would really be worth it if they were limited to a system where the cameras could only take pictures of the license plates of, a smaller list that was pre-approved by a judge who issued a warrant. That really just underscores that the whole point of the system is population level tracking, not the tracking of any specific person. So the system just operates like a 21st century general warrant where the police are effectively investigating everyone.
I want to talk a little bit about the clients in this case. I know, Rob, you mentioned them earlier at the very beginning. Who are our clients? What is motivating them to get involved in this suit? And how much courage does it take for them to sue a city over a program that they know is monitoring where they are and where they're going every hour of the day, every day of the week?
Well, to be honest, that's always the hardest part of this job. I can find constitutional issues all the live long day. The hardest thing is finding people who are brave enough to stand up and say, this is wrong, and I don't want this for myself. More importantly, I don't want this for anyone else. And Lee and Crystal both have done that. They both live in the area. Lee's in Norfolk. Crystal's right outside. They travel through the city every single day. And they're just aghast by the fact that their local officials put up these surveillance systems really with no oversight. And that they feel like, as we were talking before, they feel a bit like they're criminals, that they're being tracked everywhere they go, and it makes them feel insecure. And as we've seen, these flock cameras are in systems throughout the country. Unfortunately, we haven't seen other people stand up and fight. So I commend Lee and Crystal for being brave enough to really say, I don't want this for us. This isn't what being an American is all about.
We should wrap up here soon, but I wanted to ask you one last question because you've talked before about red light cameras and speed cameras and things like that, and about how those are kind of presumptively constitutional, and I wanted to kind of dig into that a little bit because there was a whole thing about those cameras, maybe, I don't know how long ago, 10, 15 years ago, about, are these constitutional? And it seems like, that sort of got settled. But it's interesting to me to hear those talked about as, kind of the ideal here, because I wonder, would you all be totally comfortable with those cameras, or is it better for those to also not exist?
Well, I'm a bad driver, so I don't want those cameras anywhere. But constitutionally, I do think that there is a bit of a difference, right, Rob?
Yeah, I do as well. Again, the speed camera, the red light camera, it's only catching you when you're doing a violation. Otherwise, it's leaving you alone. The best analogy, because this is just a game of analogies, the law, is like an individual cop on the street corner who, if he saw you like make a left on red or, broke some traffic violation, he could flag you down, give you a ticket. I view those cameras as being no different. And those are very different, though, from the persistent stitching together of images that allow for, as a friend of IJ put, a mosaic of your entire life. That is just constitutionally very different and something we need to push back against.
Even if there were 172 of those cameras, they wouldn't get anywhere near the amount of information that the flock cameras in Norfolk get because, like Rob said, they're only picking up people who are breaking the law, who are speeding, who are running red lights. And you can avoid getting captured by those cameras by following the law, by not running a red light, by not speeding. You can't escape the flock cameras by following the law. They're collecting everyone's movements, whether they're obeying the law or not.
All right. Well, thank you so much, guys, for coming in and talking with us today.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thanks again for watching today's episode. We got a lot of great questions about episode 16 involving Desiree Martinez and qualified immunity, so let's take a look at a few. At Rose C. 8101 writes, I work in law enforcement. Anyone knowingly giving an abuser information that could harm the abused is completely violating their oath. Well, thanks for that comment, Rose C. And coming from someone in your position, it makes it all the more powerful. I think you're absolutely right that an officer who would knowingly facilitate a domestic abuser is violating their oath to protect and serve their communities. As a law enforcement officer yourself, I'm sure you're frustrated by how these bad actors give hardworking, law-abiding officers a bad name. It makes your job harder and our communities less safe. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court ultimately declined to take up Desiree's case earlier this month, meaning that the officer who facilitated her abuse will face no civil consequences. Although that's a disappointing outcome, we're not going to stop fighting to hold officers like Shannon High accountable when they violate people's rights. At Why Do I Suddenly Have a Handle writes, qualified immunity doesn't protect criminal activity. Why isn't the abusive officer being criminally charged instead? Well, that's a fantastic question. You're right that qualified immunity doesn't protect against criminal charges. The officer who abused Desiree Martinez was criminally charged, but only ended up serving 30 days in prison after pleading no contest to a lesser misdemeanor offense. The officer who facilitated that abuse by disclosing Desiree's confidential complaint to her abuser was never criminally charged. Unfortunately, that pattern is all too common. Prosecutors are typically hesitant to bring charges against the officers they work with, meaning that civil suits like Desiree's are the only way for victims of government abuse to get justice. And as long as qualified immunity stands in the way, we at IJ are going to work to put a stop to it. At Michael J. Kosak writes, thanks for pursuing justice. You guys at IJ are awesome. The question is, how can we eliminate qualified immunity and absolute immunity for police and prosecutors? How can we get people to pressure their legislators to write laws to make it easier to go after bad actors? Well, I love this question, Michael. We at IJ recognize that meaningful change often starts at the dinner table and in the community. And that's why we launched Americans Against Qualified Immunity, or AAQI. AAQI connects everyday Americans, like yourself, who are passionate about ending qualified immunity with resources and opportunities to turn that passion into action. We let our members know about state, local, and national legislative initiatives to end qualified immunity. And we help make it easy for you to write your legislators and show your support. We also host regular events and webinars so that you can learn more about the great work that we and others are doing. If that sounds interesting to you, head to our website at www.aaqi.org to sign up and learn more. At Skoshman writes, I'm confused. Isn't qualified immunity supposed to apply when the police are doing their jobs? How is this an example of police doing their jobs? Qualified immunity should not even be applicable in the first place in this instance. Well, that's another great question, Skoshman. Unfortunately, qualified immunity doesn't care about the officer's job description. As long as the officer appears to be acting pursuant to official government authority, he can receive qualified immunity. Oftentimes, this leads to plainly unjust or even absurd outcomes. Take former IJ client Alan Minerath, for example. He owns and operates a small road construction company in Minnesota. Several of his trucks and drivers were stopped and detained for hours, not by a police officer, but by a rogue Minnesota highway engineer. That state engineer didn't have the authority to stop Alan's trucks or detain his drivers, but the 8th Circuit still gave him qualified immunity anyways, and the Supreme Court declined to take up his case. Talk about absurd. At Miria35 writes, the precedent concept makes no sense whatsoever. If these judges cannot make a decision when the facts are before them, using existing law, then they should resign. Precedent, or the idea that courts are bound by their prior decisions, is a unique aspect of the American legal system that we inherited from Great Britain. It can feel frustrating at times, particularly when bad precedent, like qualified immunity, forces future courts to make bad decisions. I know I've certainly felt that way in my time as a lawyer. The good news, though, is that with time, effort, and steady optimism, that bad precedent can change. Plessy versus Ferguson, which held that segregated schools were constitutionally permissible, stood for nearly 60 years before the Supreme Court famously overturned it in Brown versus Board of Education. Now, that groundbreaking change didn't happen overnight. It was the outcome of decades of hard work and careful strategic litigation brought by the NAACP. When IJ's founder, Chip Mellor, launched our organization over 30 years ago, he deliberately modeled our approach to strategic litigation after their work. And the success we've had at changing the law over the years is a testament to that model. All this to say, we know that changing the law is hard work. It can sometimes feel discouraging, but we're not going to give up because we know that with your support, we have an opportunity to change the world into a better place. Thanks again for watching, and make sure to tune in next time.